Building the perfect candle means picking out the perfect wick. But wick selection is really the hardest part of any candle design because you've got to account for all these different factors, from fragrance oil to wax blend to container diameter to wick type. All these things complicate the picture so much. So I'm going to share with you today a strategy you can use to overcome all of these inputs and get to the final answer faster. Let's do it! Hello, my name is Kevin from Armatage Candle Company, the premier online resource for accelerating a candle making technique in business. My name is Kevin, and in today's episode, we're going to talk about a strategy you can use to figure out exactly what wick you need for your candle faster. Because wick selection, honestly, is the hardest part of candle design. There's so many different things that impact a candle, and keeping that balance between safety and performance all comes down to the wick. It plays such a huge role. And so the strategy I'm going to share with you today is really good for accelerating the time period it takes to figure out from when you pour and build the test candle to when you test that candle and view the results, to try to narrow down that window of possible wick selection. So let's get into it. The strategy I want to share with you today can be called wickless testing, which sounds ironic given that we're trying to figure out what wick we need to use. But it's really a little simpler than that. The idea, the theory, is that if we just pour a candle with no wick in it at all, then we allow ourselves the opportunity to easily replace the wick from the candle as we test. The idea there being that if you're testing a candle and the wick is too big or too small, or you see a marker that you don't like, by not using a wick tab, we can literally pull the wick out, the bad wick, and replace it with the wick that we think is going to operate better. So say that you're testing a CD10, and as you're testing you notice it's mushrooming, or the melt pool is getting too big, or the container sides are too hot. Well, with wickless testing, because we're not building a candle with a wick tab, we only need to pull the CD10 out and replace it with an Eco 4 or a CD 7 or 8. And the whole process becomes a lot faster. Now, this isn't a substitute for the standard test, the way that we prove to ourselves as candle makers that this candle from top to bottom with the same wick works, but it does help in that intermediate stage when you're trying to figure out exactly what wick you should try, or exactly what series of wicks you should use with your wax blend. So the whole thing gets a little bit faster, but it could come with the small risk that if it works out right away, you should probably make an entirely new candle with that wick placed properly and test that too. But without further ado, let's get into it. Let's pour ourselves one of these and I'll show you how to get going with the testing. Okay, so once we've poured our candle and it's cured for a sufficient amount of time, we simply need to pretty much just poke a hole in the thing. So I have a skewer. You can use a chopstick or anything that will allow you to get through the surface of the wax fairly simply. And here I have any old wick. I'm going to start out with an Eco 2. We'll get to that in a second. So step one, really just make sure it's as centered as possible. Put a hole through the center of the candle. Ow! I call this the pilot hole that we're going to eventually stick our wick through. And pull up. So there you go. Pilot hole. A little bit of wax. And then it's really obvious, but you just stick your wick right into that hole. So this one's a little long. Just trim that guy. Good. There. Now we're ready for testing. And we'll let some time pass to see how this wick does, and we'll pretend that it's going to fail and swap the wick out just to show the process. Okay, so this has been burning for about 5 minutes, which for the sake of showing how to wickless test, we're going to pretend that something offended us greatly, and we have to blow it out now. Alright, we'll let that cool now. After determining that this wick really isn't going to work for the candle and we want to replace it with something else, we're going to need 2 tools. One is a needle nose plier, which we'll use to pull the wick out. And the other isn't really a tool, it's a supply, but we need a replacement wick. So I've chosen a CD7 here as a replacement inside the candle. Currently we have an Eco 2. And so this next step is fairly simple, but it can go wrong in so many different ways, so just be very careful and don't beat yourself up if it goes bad. But we're going to take these pliers and we're going to yank that wick right out of the candle. So they came out well. You can see I probably didn't put enough wick in there in the first place, but before I reinsert the next wick, I'm just going to double check my pilot hole goes all the way through. Again, using a skewer or a chopstick. So I've reestablished the pilot hole. Now I'm going to take my CD7 and just plug it into the new hole there. Right. Give it a good trim. Need new scissors. Oh my gosh. Come on, you cheap monkey. Okay. So with our new wick in there, we can light the candle and test. No need to heat gun that hole. You can if you want, but generally this will fill in just fine. Repeat until you have something that works. So I hope some of that makes sense. One thing I want to leave you with, and it's super critical, especially if you're making candles to sell, and it's this. Remember, every wick tells a story. Wherever you burn that wick in the candle, depending on how deep into the candle you are, you may get different results. And so while this strategy does really good for allowing you quick iterations without creating an entirely new candle, you do lose some of the effect of what happens when you burn a fresh candle with one wick from top to bottom. And so what am I getting at? Well, I believe strongly that if you perform the industry standard candle test, and if you want to know more about that, check out that video. It's important that you pour a fresh candle with that size wick and burn it from top to bottom. Why is that? Well, burning at the top of the candle impacts subsequent burns below the candle. Especially when you're testing with a softer wax like soy, the way that melt pool forms, it actually creates a literal pool. There's a deep end right in the middle. And the characteristics of that wax are different after they harden back up and that polymorphic nature kicks in. So the point I want to make is that while you can go very fast checking in wicks and in and out, you don't actually get the full story, I believe, when you find that right wick halfway down. I think you still need to create an entirely new candle. But I don't want to muddy the water too much. I think it's a great testing strategy. It'll get you ahead. It's super quick to plop those wicks in and out, especially if you're used to performing more of a traditional wickectomy. One more final thought. The fact that we don't have a wick tab supporting these at the base of the candle means that if you're super deep into the candle, you could literally lose the wick. Like if too much wax melts and there's not enough structural support, that wick could sink because it's not bound to anything. And so this strategy works well with taller containers like this, but if you're trying to do wick replacements in a wickless candle with something shallow like a tin, or even further down in a candle like this, you could lose the wick, and then it's like, well, what gains do you really have? So you use with caution, you use with judgment, and I think that incorporating this into your strategy can be very effective, but it comes with small risks like that. Anyways, if you found any of this helpful, I hope you give me a like. Otherwise, I hope you have an awesome week, and I can't wait to see you next time. Bye-bye.